Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. You can find archive episodes of this program on our YouTube channel at Freedom and Prosperity Radio, as well as find out more about things like our Tuesday morning group coalition meetings and our public policy work at tertiumquids.org. Welcome back to the program. Political Director for Middle Resolution PAC, Nancy Smith, and we're going to get into last Tuesday's election. Nancy, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio again. How are you doing?
I'm well. Good morning.
Thank you for doing what you do. And I know that everyone's worst nightmare came true, and it didn't even have to do specifically with this seat or that seat. It gave Terry McAuliffe the ability to flounce about from TV set to TV set, telling us how he's seemingly single-handedly turned Virginia into California. And I don't necessarily believe that, but I sure as heck know that they had one heck of a get-out-the-vote campaign this year. We've seen anecdotal statistics from smaller races, Commonwealth attorneys races, where 33% more votes were cast than 4 years ago. So something is driving folks out to the polls. Are you seeing the same thing?
We saw the same thing. My home county is Henrico County, and so we had through our GOP unit, where I assist, some operations. We had thought we had a pretty reasonable number of sample ballots ready to go, based on 15 and 17 turnout, and we were running out of sample ballots midday. So we were scrambling to sort of adjust the number of voters coming in. So it was quite heavy. Heavy.
It sounds like, even on the GOP side, for example, Robert Tracy, Commonwealth's attorney in Albemarle County, received 5,000 more votes than he received 4 years ago and lost by a considerable margin. So I can't say that it was the GOP that failed in the Get Out the Vote campaign, but what does the conservative-minded voter need to hear or see more from the parties in an effort to get more people out to vote?
Well, I think what I've done, and I think we're all reading a lot of the same material online in the newspapers about the changes in Virginia. And I think, at least for me, instead of looking at individual races, because it was such a blowout, right, we could take any given race and say, okay, what was the problem there? But I think it's a bigger statewide problem that perhaps we as conservatives or Republicans have not addressed. And pulled a bunch of information on the statistical changes and the demographic changes in Virginia, and they're pretty astounding when we look at a state that historically has gone red has been red for a long time, and now has shifted so dramatically. So I can give you a few of those stats if there's some interest.
Well, is there, I want to get into some of those numbers because certainly it has been predicted over the 12 years I've been hosting this program that as the federal government swamp, if you will, has grown, more and more Virginians are government employees. And why would they vote for smaller government if it might put their own job in peril? But now with the president, slashing departments and going through attrition and actually seeing people losing their job, I guess it's redoubled some of the fears of those in Northern Virginia, especially that with government shrinkage comes their job opportunity shrinkage.
I think so. I mean, no one wants to see their job taken, regardless of how some of us feel about the federal government and the need to sort of cut budgets and try and get the federal government down to something reasonable. So everybody's always going to vote for their own personal interest. I mean, that makes sense. I think the one thing that we're not looking at as Republicans are the number of voters who are moving into the state, migration and immigration, who are simply coming in from other states. I don't necessarily have all the information on where they're coming from, but I know that in Central Virginia, as Henrico County, Chesterfield, as the metro area grows, and as the IT corridor here is booming, a lot of people are coming in from other areas, and they certainly don't seem to be voting Republican as we're seeing the area change. But right now, interestingly, if you look at the change, and I think Loudoun County is one of the biggest factors for us. So Fairfax, we all know Fairfax is, you can only go up in Fairfax to build. You can't go out.
Right.
But Loudoun is still full of open land that used to be horse farms, and is now full of sort of the IT industry, any number of industries that are coming in that all support the Washington, swamp per se. So we have huge numbers of voters there. Interestingly, 1 in 10, just I'll give you the stat, in 1970, 1 out of 100 Virginians were foreign born. Here we are 50 years later, and 1 in 10 Virginians are not born in this country. So while we're not a border state, we are a state that has a large influx of immigrants, and they have not been voting with us, even though I think they align with us in many ways.
Well, and certainly you see that. I know my in-laws were both born in Scotland, and they would come over and they loved the freedom of the United States, but then they would say, but, my cousin doesn't have to pay for health care, and there are little things that, without the robust debate of why that's not working, or 10 years later they find out their cousin has a grievous illness because the National Health Service failed to diagnose it or something like that, you wind up struggling with the idea of, well, I've gotten away from a bad situation, whether it be emigration from the northern states, the Rust Belt, or other countries, and now come to this great free place. But I'd like a little bit of what I grew up with, a little bit of these things that I remember is, I guess that's only fair, and maybe it's on the candidates to explain why, as a conservative candidate for office, that that's not to their benefit if they enact them through another candidate.
Yeah, I think so. I think the idea of keeping more money in your pocket is something that we don't do a great job of talking about. In other words, we frame it as taxation and what are you going to, what's the government want from you that's not going to be helpful, instead of what can the government do but keep it at a reasonable cost, and while you can maintain your independence and buy a home, invest, everything else that I think that America typically believes in a capitalist society. But I don't think we transfer the message well. We tend to be too wonkish, as we know. We love to talk policy, and the Democrats excel at using emotion and rationalizing their policies that may or may not align with many of these families.
Nancy Smith is on with us, political director for Middle Resolution PAC, and we're talking about the demographics of Virginia post this election. Nick Freitas, you were just bringing up something that reminded me of something Nick Freitas said as it relates to guns, but he opens the phrase where he says, when the policy fails to deliver the results you're promising your constituents, you'll be back. And in this case, he was talking about guns, but I think the same is applicable with health care and education policy and so many other things. The promises are made. 4 years later, re-election campaigns are built around, well, we'll get it right this time, or it was those nasty Republicans' fault that we weren't able to do all these things. That's the messaging I think you're talking about, is finding a simpler way that maybe the president and some other folks are being able to reach into communities we've never been able to really make the case to before. Is that what I'm getting from you?
I think so. I think, and I just did when I was yesterday morning, when I was with the Tuesday morning group, I said to the group of individuals there, I said, all of our time should be spent with other communities instead of with ourselves. We already know what we believe. We typically know what the Republican stands for when they go to the polls. However, we are not embracing those communities and talking to them. And Republicans are usually charged with, well, you don't care about minority communities until 6 months before Election Day. And I'm afraid that is typically true.
Yeah.
I think it's a truism. So if we don't start to help people understand that there are American ideals that are going to benefit them in every way, between freedom, capitalism, protection of the rights that they believe that they should have, then we can't expect those voters to come to our side.
Yeah, I agree. I saw a piece after the Virginia elections that said that the real race for 2020, the premise of the article was the real race for 2020 was, can the Democratic Party win over enough of the white suburban voter to counteract the black community that seems to be warming to the president and his brand of republicanism. You see Benedict College and his reforms gives him their achievement award for criminal justice reform and things like that. Are you sensing the same thing in the demographics of Virginia? Has the party of McAuliffe gone after the white suburban voter and tried to win them away, saying, "Oh, you would never invite Donald Trump to a barbecue at your house. You don't want to vote with them."
Absolutely, and that may be the bigger issue than anything else. Suburban women, and I've been a suburban woman for the last 40 years, even though I grew up in rural Virginia. It is the movement of suburban women away from Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
I worked for Dave Brad in 14 and 16, and I certainly understand what was going on in 18 when suburban women decided they didn't like him, which I believe was largely because we don't like Trump. And if you're a Republican, then you must be a Trumper, and we have to do what we can to diminish your support. So I think we see it. We've certainly seen it in Chesterfield and Henrico in Dave's case. One of the things I say about Trump and people, and I think women in particular, who find his tweeting and his comments so egregious and no, they're certainly not presidential, is that the culture, I think the rawness of the culture started a long time ago. And I think that Trump is the result of that and not the cause of it. And I truly believe, and I think this is true, that if people were to go back and examine the TV shows that they now watch that 20 years ago they would never have turned on, they wouldn't have allowed their children in front of it. If we look at what goes on in social media, and I think we see the cultural changes, I think Trump is really sort of a result of that, just on the culture part.
Is it unfair to point out, though, that some of the horrible things that they've said about Donald Trump, they've said about Mitt Romney and John McCain as well? I mean, Harry Reid took to the floor of the Senate and said, "I've heard people tell me he hasn't filed his tax returns," knowing it was a lie, knowing he wasn't going to face any repercussions, but it probably cost Mitt Romney the election.
Well, I think that the double standard is alive and well. That on the Democrat side, you can exaggerate and be untruthful in what you say. On our side, any statement that's out of that's a slight error is taken to task as a serious
impeachable
political mistake. So we don't have a whole lot of room for error as Democrats do.
Is there a lesson, demographically speaking, reaching back into communities that may, not like the president's style, but the substance of it? Because I've seen in both in the empty seats and those being the empty lines on ballots where the Republicans didn't feel like contesting, the retiring members of the Virginia General Assembly who don't want to be in the party of President Trump. Can we get back to substance over style and talk about some of the things the president has done or the administration has done? I think Dave tried to do that in his race against Abigail Spanberger, but perhaps we need to school on that a little bit more. What do you think about that, Nancy?
I don't know that we can. Trump is Trump. He's not going to change his colors. And for people like me who support him, my standard line is don't listen to what he says. It's turn off your Twitter account and watch what he does.
Mm-hmm.
And if people are willing to look at what he does in terms of his policies, I mean, my retirement account is much better than it was. Everyone financially is better off. And so if you're able to do that, but some people seem to just dig in with Trump. And it's so understandable. I can't disagree that he's a lightning rod. But I think if you look at everything he's doing, the administration is just doing unbelievably good work. And I think it's a tough one.
Does there need to be a change? And I know this was commonplace. I was on several national radio shows as the Virginia expert myself, being asked, what about the failures of the Republican Party? I heard callers on national shows saying Virginia went blue because the Republican Party failed. Do there need to be examinations there?
Well, I think that, the short answer is yes. The party, from the party apparatus, and full disclosure, I was on the 7th District Committee when Dave was in office, so I know a lot of good people on that committee. But the party, I think, is chronically behind the curve in terms of understanding what it takes to build coalitions, to reach out to voters, to change the messaging strategy, and I think we're always behind the curve in Virginia. Now, having said that, there were some very, very good candidates who ran this time. And interestingly, the belief that we need women running for office, I think, is true. I dislike gender politics as much as anybody else. I'm all about the quality of the candidate, not the gender you were born.
Amen.
However, the move to have more women run, I think there was pretty good effort there. And the presumption that if you're a woman, then you can succeed where a man can't. Well, we didn't necessarily see that happen. We did see some good female candidates come through, but those were largely districts that were safe enough that they could succeed. But there were women who ran really, really good campaigns and simply couldn't prevail. And I would say the candidates that either we supported or that I was involved with on some level, they were some of the best campaigns that I think have been run.
Nancy, I'm sorry, go ahead.
But again, people walked away. Women walked away from some of their own gender candidates because they had an R behind their name, and I think largely it was that R that was more problematic than the individual who was running.
Last one for you, Nancy. Nancy Smith, political director for Middle Resolution PAC, and she's worked, with Congressman Brad and candidate Brad. Is it about the candidate more than the party? I think of the insurgency of Dave in the primary, and Gray Delaney, and the work that was done there, and you were a part of that, or Bob McDonnell and the way that he and his campaign won the state over by going to every town once a week at least and holding a rally and really making it almost a retail marathon and buried creeds in effort. Is that what needs to happen more than waiting for State Central Committee to get its act together and then pick somebody?
Well, I think the strength of the caucuses in Virginia always makes for competition between the political entities that are either vying for financial support or looking to push candidates forward. So between the House caucus, Senate caucus, and the party, everybody's sort of juggling for some level of influence in Virginia politics. I don't know,
and yet we have none now.
Right. So we don't know anything. So we can only go up, right? We sort of hit rock bottom here.
Amen.
But I don't know that. That candidates can necessarily fix this. Now, Vance Wilkins, former speaker, is a good friend, good mentor to me, and one of his rules of thumb is that if you don't start your campaign 2 years in advance, you shouldn't be running. Well, I would almost extend that beyond that now. And unfortunately, many candidates come in 6-8 months before an election when there simply is not enough time to do it. So I think we have to have a much longer game than we've had in the past. And frankly, I don't know that if a candidate wants to run now, they shouldn't be looking at a race, 4 years out, 3 years out. And that's hard to do. Most people have lives and have to earn a living and have families. But I think we have to have a much longer game of being able to go out and build such loyalty to a candidate that regardless of the party, that those voters walk in that day into the polls and are loyal to that individual. So candidates always matter. But the time frame, I think we've got to improve upon.
You remind me of an article I read about broadcasting and why the Olympics suffer in ratings, and they track it back to the end of programs like Wide World of Sports, and that would show us skiers and speed skaters, and so that when the Olympics came around, we were familiar with them. It is something similar, and you triggered me by saying that. we'll have 5 or 6 people primary each other for a congressional seat nomination, and nobody run for school board. How do we remind people? I try to with my radio work, but remind people that we need school board members and supervisors and city councilors as much as we need congresspeople and delegates.
Well, I think a lot of the recruiting has to be done at the local level. Sometimes it's not always sexy to run for school board, but it sure sounds important to run for a state Senate seat. Mm-hmm. And I think people frequently, and I've met any number of candidates that I've tried to walk back from their inclination to run for a seat when they've never even engaged in politics, and simply don't understand the work it takes, the money to raise. I mean, all of the dynamics that it takes to get into politics and win races. So I think sometimes people overshoot on our side because they see the issues, they're concerned about the state, concerned about the country, and they want to get in and fix it. So their motives are good. However, they're understanding that you've got to start somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And I think people who are involved in the communities and do run for those local seats, then they really are in position to run. They know what a campaign is about. They know how to govern.
But they have a base of supporters.
People overshoot.
Yeah, and they already come in with a base of supporters from whatever region they were in, whether it be a school board or a board of supervisors or anything like that. Hey, Nancy, thank you so much for your visit this week. And Middle Resolution, what's the best place for people to read more from you there? Is it middleresolution.org? middleresolution.org, yes, and we have a couple of meetings coming up. We'll be doing a quarterly meeting here in Richmond very soon, and we have an education arm that I'd love to talk to you about another time, a C4. Great, yeah, absolutely.
Choice.
Absolutely.
So you can find us pretty easily, certainly online on our website.
Well, thank you so much for your visit this week.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. And thank you all for listening. And again, you can find out more about us at tertiumquids.org. Nancy mentioned speaking at the Tuesday Morning Group Coalition meeting. You can find out more about being part of those there. Our podcasts are all up at our YouTube channel, Freedom and Prosperity Radio. So for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. Until next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.